In today's culture of immense cynicism, you've probably heard people utter the phrase, well, isn't everyone selfish?
Made you feel good, so that makes it selfish. Look, there's no unselfish good deeds, sorry.
After all, even someone like Mother Teresa, who devotes her life to helping those in need, trying to be a good person by the standards of the Christian faith, people would argue, yeah, she was selfish because what she wanted to be was a good person. She wanted to help others who were less fortunate than herself. So, does the fact that she pursued what she wanted to make her selfish? Well, thankfully, this is precisely the question that the late psychologist Nathaniel Branden answered in his essay titled Isn't Everyone Selfish? In the collection of essays titled The Virtue of Selfishness. But before we get into the weeds of whether everyone is selfish, whether everyone isn't selfish, we first need to actually look at the field that covers this issue of selfishness and selflessness. And that field is ethics. So what exactly is ethics? Because many philosophers over many centuries have argued between one particular moral code and another, arguing that one course of action is moral whereas another is immoral. But what exactly is ethics just in general? Well, the definition that Branden provides is that provided by novelist philosopher Ayn Rand. And the definition she provides for ethics is a code of values by which man's choices and actions are to be guided. But not just any old choices and actions. It's not as if ethics' primary concern is which ice cream flavour should I choose or which film should I choose to watch. But she's specifically talking about the choices and actions that will determine the course of a man's life. And that's what ethics is really concerned about. It's a code of values to guide man's choices and actions. Choices and actions that will determine the course of his life. Now, notice in the definition of ethics, we've got a whole host of concepts there. We've got man, guide, value, choice, action, code, and a few others as well. All of those concepts are going to be reliant on their own chain of other concepts that they're reliant on, much in the same way that ethics is reliant on all of those concepts. But the one that Branden chooses to focus on more than any other is the concept of value. Now, what are values? Well, in a very basic sense, values are simply that which one acts to gain and or keep. One example of value could be your attendance of a sports game with a friend of yours. A sports game that features a team that you're both very passionate about, both die-hard fans. Another one could be you watching a new episode of a TV show as soon as it's released because you love that TV show. And a third one could be buying your partner a thoughtful gift on the day of your anniversary. So it can include a number of things. And those three examples are three of many other examples that I'm sure you can think of yourself. But for every value, there are two prerequisites. You first need to answer the questions of value, to whom, and for what reason. And this is where Branden argues is the distinction between selfishness and selflessness. Is the reason behind this because you are to be the beneficiary of this action? So do you watch that sports game with your friend because you genuinely want to have that experience of going to the sports game? Or do you do it because your friends told you that nobody else wants to go with him and you just think, yeah, okay, I'll go along with him? And this is the main distinction that needs to be made between selfishness and selflessness. The ultimate issue comes down to who is the beneficiary of your actions. Is it you or is it others? Now, given this view of selfishness, does this mean that Mother Teresa is selfish? After all, you could argue that the reason why she's helping all these people who are in need, all these people who are very poor, much poorer than herself, you could argue that the reason why is because she wants to help them. Because this is something that she desires. She desires to be a good person. So could you therefore say that she's the beneficiary of her action? Well, I think to go over this, I think we first need to actually ask ourselves, how do we determine what is good for people? Now, I think a good point of comparison here is to compare this issue to that of a farmer who's trying to increase their crop yields. Now, in the specialized world in which we live today, if you want to do this and you want to be successful in it, you're going to have to consult a whole range of experts. The farmer's going to have to consult agronomists, people who specialize in crop production and soil management. He'll also have to consult soil scientists, people who will help analyse and improve the soil fertility by looking at the pH, the structure, drainage, and so on. But the people he'll be looking at would be plant pathologists, people who would diagnose and manage diseases that can limit the yield. And these are three of many experts he's going to have to consult. And not only that, he's also going to have to look into which of these experts are actually worth hiring, which of these are actually snake oil salesmen, which of these actually have genuine expertise. And the list of different problems that the farmer is going to encounter are almost endless. And there are so many things that they're going to have to consider when it comes to pursuing this particular goal. And something that's common to all of these people being consulted, what's common to the ultimate goal behind bringing in all these people of expertise into the farmer's life, is that the farmer is trying to actually understand the nature of his crops. He's trying to understand the nature of the soil in his fields. He's trying to understand the nature of his environment and how that's going to affect his goal. And ultimately what he's trying to do is he's trying to actually understand the nature of the particular task at hand and all the different components that go into it. And it's only by doing all these things that he's going to stand a chance, not even necessarily being guaranteed success, at actually increasing the crop yields. And in precisely the same way as the farmer is having to consult all these different areas of expertise in order to find out what's actually good for his crops, you also need to acquire knowledge about what is good for man, that is, man by his very nature. What are his requirements for survival? What things are actually good for him? What things are bad for him? And what Branden then goes on to argue is that selfishness actually consists of two things. Not solely of these two things, but these two things are central to it. One, a hierarchy of values, all ordered in reference to the standard of man's life. And two, a refusal to give up on one of those higher values in favour of a lower value, or simply something that isn't even a value on the hierarchy, which in effect is a sacrifice. Even though for someone to be selfish, they need to be the primary beneficiary of their actions, just because they're the primary beneficiary does not mean they're going to be the sole beneficiary. One example that Branden provides in his essay is the example of the revolutionary soldier who refuses to bow down to the tyrannical forces that could devastate his life. He argues that such a soldier, rather than actually acting in a sacrificial way, is doing so selfishly. After all, if you claim that his choice to fight against tyranny in favour of freedom is a sacrifice, you're saying in effect that he would prefer tyranny over freedom, and that is what constitutes selfless action. He's giving up a higher value in favour of a lower value. And yet that's not true. He's clearly behaving very selfishly. It's in his interest to secure his freedom against whatever tyrannical forces are threatening that. But it's worth remembering that he's not going to be the only beneficiary of that. Think of all the neighbours on his street who, regardless of whether they choose to fight or not, regardless of whether they want to fight or not, it's still in their interest to actually be free. And this is something that he is actually achieving. Not for them, primarily. It's for himself. But they're also going to be beneficiaries of this action. And it's not only them, but you can think of maybe his parents or, many other elderly members of the society that's being threatened. They will also benefit. They're not committing any actions themselves, but they are going to benefit from this. And so far in this example, I've just been focusing on people who might still be alive at this particular point. But you've also got to remember about the children of the soldier, maybe the children's children, or the children of his neighbours that are yet to be born. And on and on and on it goes. The point being that just because you're actually selfish does not mean you're going to be the only beneficiary. even if you are the primary beneficiary. Now, just going back to what we covered earlier, the case of the farmer trying to increase his crop yields. Well, if you look back at that example, and it doesn't have to be agriculture, it can be any industry, it could be entertainment, it could be mining, it could be software design, whatever it is. Whatever goal you set yourself in those fields, one thing is common to all of them, and that is the wishing won't make it so. To achieve something in any of these areas, you need to put the work in. And just like the farmer had to hire the consultants who themselves had to put in the work in order for them to acquire the necessary knowledge in order for them to be in these positions to actually help farmers with their issues, so is the case with people involved in the mining industry, whether you're someone involved in the management or the engineering team or the person with the pickaxe. The point being that all of these areas actually require work. The knowledge you actually require in order to do well in these areas actually has to be produced. And like I said before, wishing won't make it so. And the exact same applies to selfishness. To actually understand, to actually pursue what is in your own self-interest, this in itself is a body of knowledge and has to be treated as such. And just because you do something, just because you feel like it's good for you, just because you feel like you want to do it in the moment, that doesn't make it selfish. Consider the case of the person who gets drunk the night before their test because they simply feel like it. You know, they don't want to really be aware of the fact they've got a test the following day. Or you have the person who chooses to continue hanging around with his friends, going out to expensive bars, expensive restaurants, even though they're spending well beyond their means, but purely because he wants to keep up appearances and wants to make it to his friends that he's actually doing right. These simply include people who are surrendering to their feelings, not actually questioning the origin of their emotions, and going ahead with it without any actual thinking about the consequences of these things will be, with no consideration whatsoever about whether this is good for them or not. You can't consider such people to be selfish. And just to highlight the absurdity of this idea, Branden invites us in the essay to consider the case of someone who says that he felt that by murdering and robbing people that he was benefiting others. Would we actually then consider that person to be selfless because they simply felt like it? Absolutely not. And yet, we seem to have a double standard when it comes to selfishness. Why is this the case? Well, Branden has a really interesting take on this. He argues this is actually a legacy of mysticism. But how is this legacy of mysticism, you might be asking? My interpretation of this point is that he's referring to the way Christianity would appeal to its followers. The argument that was made by the theologians was that if you want to actually achieve eternal happiness in the afterlife, if you actually want to flourish in the long term, you could phrase it as, then you cannot afford to pursue earthly luxuries in this life if you actually want to achieve eternal salvation. What was made implicit here, never explicit, was that it's actually in your own self-interest to give up earthly luxuries in this life if you're going to achieve values in the afterlife. And so what you had in effect here was this idea that it is in your self-interest to not pursue your self-interest on this earth. And what Branden argues is that it's only this kind of warped thinking that has enabled this idea that pursuing whatever you feel like is somehow selfish. But what is the actual issue here that Branden has with this argument? After all, he's covered already that selfishness is actually a body of knowledge that you actually need to acquire, you actually need to work for in order to actually understand what is good for you. And on the flip side of that, he also points out that it's not just about pursuing your feelings. What is it that everyone's getting so wrong about this concept? Why is it that so many people think that everyone's selfish? Well, the fallacy that Branden identifies is an informal fallacy, specifically the fallacy of equivocation. But a number of you probably haven't heard of this fallacy, so let's go through it very quickly. And what better way to go over the fallacy of equivocation than with an example? Let's consider this argument put forward by say Jamie. So Jamie argues that nothing is better than pizza. He then says, a slice of bread is better than nothing. Conclusion, a slice of bread is better than pizza. Now, what's actually wrong with this argument? Because on the surface you might look at it and think, well, I mean, it checks out. Premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. On the surface it looks pretty straightforward. But the problem here isn't so much to do with the form of the argument, it's to do with the contents of the proposition, hence why it's called an informal fallacy. Well, the problem here is that the treatment of the concept nothing is identical in both cases. In both of the separate propositions, it's actually got two very different meanings. So in the first one, nothing is better than pizza. By nothing in this case, we simply mean no food item. But in this second case, what we're talking about is no food item available for eating. And what you could think of it as here is like a linguistic bait and switch, which looks like reasoning but in fact is nonsense. But in the case of people arguing that everyone's selfish, what is it that's actually being equivocated here? Well, what Branden identifies is that what you actually have here is a really gross equivocation. You effectively have the concept of motivated behaviour being treated the same as selfish behaviour. So this idea that just because someone might want something necessarily means that it's selfish. And going back to those examples we saw earlier, just because somebody wants to get drunk the night before their test, that does not necessarily mean they're selfish. Having a motivation for your action does not make your action selfish. It is a basic elementary fact of psychology that all purposeful behaviour is motivated. But what the field of ethics is concerned with is by what should man be motivated. And when this distinction, this really important distinction between motivated behaviour more generally and selfish behaviour in particular is blanked out, this is what's causing the conceptual chaos that people who argue that everyone is selfish are suffering from. To claim that everyone is selfish is often taken to be a really cynical comment. But something that Branden points out is that to be selfish, that is to actually commit yourself to discovering what is good for you, to actually live by that code, not compromise, not give in to any whim in the face of any discomfort or danger. To actually do that, to actually stick by your guns and actually commit yourself to that pursuit of knowledge and acting on that knowledge is actually something profoundly difficult to achieve and something that very, very few people actually achieve. And this comment that everyone's selfish, far from being a cynical insult, actually grants mankind a compliment that he is not yet worthy of.